The morning sun fought a losing battle against the heavy gray clouds as the young teacher stood before the towering iron gates of Blackwood Academy. Their fingers gripped the handle of the leather briefcase so tightly that their knuckles turned a ghostly white, mirroring the stone gargoyles perched atop the school's entrance. This was supposed to be the pinnacle of a long journey, the moment years of study and idealistic dreams of teaching finally bore fruit. Yet as the gates creaked open with a groan that sounded far too much like a warning, the pride the protagonist felt was quickly being swallowed by a cold, leaden ball of anxiety. Blackwood was a Gothic monolith of dark brick and suffocating ivy that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Stepping into the main foyer, the transition from the outside world felt absolute. The air inside was stagnant, carrying the faint metallic scent of floor wax. The protagonist expected the usual morning cacophony of a high school, the slamming of lockers and the frantic whispers of students, but there was only a silence so thick it felt physical. Their footsteps echoed against the vaulted ceilings, sounding like gunshots in an empty cathedral. They checked their watch. It was precisely 8 o'clock, the time when the hallways should have been a chaotic sea of teenagers. Instead, the corridors stretched out like long, dark arteries, devoid of any visible life. The protagonist found room 302 on the 3rd floor, their breath coming in shallow hitches. When they pushed the heavy oak door open, the hinges didn't make a sound. They stepped inside, the planned greeting dying in their throat. 30 students were already seated, their backs perfectly straight and their hands folded neatly atop their desks. They didn't turn to look. They didn't whisper to their neighbors. They simply stared forward with vacant, milky eyes that seemed to look through the chalkboard and into something far beyond the walls of the classroom. The atmosphere was stifling, an unnatural stillness that made the hair on the teacher's arms stand up. As the protagonist made their way toward the podium, their eyes were drawn to a single empty desk in the center of the front row. It stood out like a jagged wound. Unlike the others, this desk was adorned with a small bundle of fresh lilies, their white petals already beginning to brown and curl at the edges. Carved deep into the wood of the desktop, as if done by a frantic, desperate hand, was a single name: Leo. The deep scratches were raw, a stark contrast to the sterile, haunting perfection of the rest of the room. "Good morning, class," the protagonist said, their voice cracking slightly. They tried to maintain a professional composure, pulling the attendance sheet from their bag. "I'm your new teacher. Let's begin by taking roll." They called out the first name on the list, then the second, and the third. Silence. Not a single head turned. Not a single student acknowledged the teacher's presence or the names of their peers. They remained like statues, their breathing so synchronized and shallow, it was almost imperceptible. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. A wave of nausea washed over the protagonist. They reached down to steady themselves against the podium, and that's when they saw it. A small, yellowed scrap of paper taped to the underside of the wood. It was covered in frantic handwriting. "Don't look at the clock," it read, "and never open the basement door." Their heart hammered against their ribs. Just as they went to pull the note free, the school bell rang. It was not a chime. It was a high-pitched, distorted scream that tore through the silence, vibrating in the protagonist's very teeth. In unison, every student stood up. The protagonist lunged for the handle of the classroom door, but it clicked shut before they could reach it, locked firmly from the outside. Behind them, the clock hands began to spin wildly, whirring backward in a blurred circle. The protagonist's hands trembled as they gripped the edges of the podium. The students remained standing, a phalanx of stiff uniforms and unblinking eyes. Desperate, they forced a smile that felt like a crack in dry clay. They opened the history textbook to a random page, their voice shaking as they began to lecture about the fall of empires. But as they spoke, a low sound rose from the desks, an inhuman murmuring. It was a dry, abrasive rustling, like the sound of a radio caught between stations. Lips unmoving, the air grew thick with static whispers. The more they lectured, the louder the static became, vibrating the very floorboards. It was a suffocating wall of noise that devoured their words until they were shouting just to hear their own thoughts. When the bell screamed again, the door opened. The students sat down in a sudden motion that shook the room. They stumbled into the hallway, desperate for air, colliding with a ghostly man. He was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over a skull-like face. This was the veteran teacher, whose eyes were darting toward every shadow. Before they could ask for help, the man grabbed their arm with a grip like ice. He hissed that the curriculum was the only thing keeping them alive. He warned that the Foundation was always listening, always hungry, and that any deviation would be met with swift correction. He vanished into shadows, leaving the scent of decay. Driven by a frantic need for answers, they slipped toward the faculty room. Inside were heavy iron filing cabinets. They searched through the L section until they found it. Leo's file. The folder contained a photo of a boy unlike the vacant students. The notes inside were chilling. Leo had vanished exactly 1 year ago today, on the first day of the previous teacher's tenure. Only a handwritten note remained from the administration stating that his absence was procedurally necessary for the balance of the institution. A heavy shadow fell across the file. They looked up to find Principal Vane standing in the doorway. His tall frame blocked the exit. His smile was wide and perfect, but his eyes remained as cold as a winter grave. He didn't ask why they were there. He simply closed the file. Vane explained that attrition was a vital part of the process. Every great institution required a certain degree of loss to maintain its structural integrity. He warned that they needed to return to their post immediately. "The school provides for those who provide for it," he whispered, his hand resting heavily on the teacher's shoulder. They fled back toward the 3rd floor. As they moved, the school began to transform. The hallways stretched, making the exit feel miles away. The dark brick walls throbbed. They could see the veins of the building pulsing beneath the plaster, a rhythmic contraction that made the entire structure feel like a living organism. In desperation, they remembered the note under the podium. They reached behind a heavy radiator and found a leather-bound journal belonging to Leo. The pages were filled with frantic sketches of the basement and descriptions of a selection process. Leo wrote that the school didn't just teach, it fed on the hope and life force of the educators. Returning to room 302 felt like entering a tomb. As they moved toward the front, a student, the girl next to the empty desk, reached out and grabbed their hand. For a fleeting second, the milky film cleared from her eyes. She leaned in, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "You aren't the teacher," she whispered, her fingers digging into their skin. "You're the sacrifice." The clarity vanished, leaving her a hollow shell. Suddenly, a rhythmic thudding vibrated the floor. It sounded like a massive heart beating deep in the earth, or a giant fist pounding on the floorboards from below. The lights above began to flicker, casting long, jerky shadows, before dying with a glass-shattering pop, plunging the room into darkness. The darkness in room 302 was not merely an absence of light. It was a suffocating weight that pressed against the protagonist's chest. When their eyes finally adjusted, the 30 students were gone. In their place, 30 silhouettes stood tall, darker than the surrounding gloom, mimicking the rigid, unnatural posture of the children who had sat there moments before. These were shadows of souls already consumed, and they began to turn their featureless heads toward the teacher's podium in a slow, agonizingly silent unison. The rhythmic pounding from beneath the floorboards reached a deafening crescendo, a heartbeat that shook the very stone foundation of Blackwood Academy. Driven by a mixture of terror and a desperate need for closure, the protagonist fled the room. The hallway had transformed. The walls were slick with a dark, pulsing substance, and the air smelled of ozone. At the far end of the corridor, the basement door stood wide open. A pale, sickly green light spilled from the darkness, beckoning the teacher toward the source of the school's terrible pulse. The descent was a journey into a mechanical nightmare. In the center of a cavernous subterranean chamber sat a massive, ancient machine, a chaotic assembly of brass gears and pulsing organic matter. Standing in a wide circle around the device were Principal Vane and the gaunt faculty, their faces illuminated by the eerie, flickering glow. The missing students were there too, including a flickering, translucent figure that was surely Leo. They stood in a deep trance, their spirits being drawn into the machine through thin, glowing filaments of light. This was the Foundation, a parasite that thrived on the life force and hope of the educators it lured into its halls. Principal Vane turned, his unnerving smile wider than ever, gesturing toward an empty spot in the ritual circle. But the protagonist felt the weight of Leo's journal in their pocket. The forbidden knowledge within those pages was not just a record of horror, it was a blueprint for sabotage. The teacher realized they could run and save themselves, leaving the children to be hollowed out forever. Or they could use the journal to disrupt the cruel harmony of the machine. Choosing to stay, the protagonist lunged toward the center of the room, shouting the dissonant, rhythmic incantations Leo had transcribed. As the words filled the chamber, the machine began to groan. The rhythmic heartbeat faltered, turning into a frantic, mechanical stutter. Vane's smile vanished, replaced by a look of abyssal rage as the glowing filaments began to snap. The physical structure of the basement started to crack, heavy masonry falling from the ceiling as the school's malevolent spirit was thrown into chaos. "Run!" the protagonist screamed at the children, though their voice was nearly drowned out by the screeching gears. The shadows began to regain their human form. The teacher grabbed the hand of the girl from the front row, dragging her toward the stairs as the school began to collapse. The hallways were shifting and twisting like a dying organism, trying to trap the escapees within its stone ribs one last time. They burst through the heavy front doors just as the sun touched the horizon. Panting and covered in grit, the protagonist turned to look back. Blackwood Academy stood tall and silent, the cracks in its facade vanishing as if they had never been. It looked perfectly peaceful, a prestigious academy waiting for a new day. The girl they had saved was gone, vanished into the evening mist, leaving the teacher standing alone at the gate. As the protagonist started their car, a sense of hollow victory settled in. They glanced at the gate one last time. A maintenance man was already there, calmly posting a help wanted sign for tomorrow morning. The cycle had not been broken, it had merely reset. Then, the protagonist caught their reflection in the mirror. Their eyes, once bright with idealism, had turned a vacant, milky white. The school had claimed its sacrifice after all.